great to be with you, and I appreciate, first of all, just being able to see your faces. I know often on Zoom people black out their screens, and I love the opportunity to meet with students and people in different places. And as Professor Magnuson mentioned, I've been really fortunate to collaborate and work with you, Stefan, over the years, and to visit Karlstad on a number of occasions, a wonderful and beautiful community, which you're fortunate to, a place you're fortunate to live and study at. And just to relay a brief anecdote, on one of my visits, I was speaking, I believe, in Dr. Gustafsson, Henrik Gustafsson's class, who you may know. And I was sharing a story about how I grew up in Calgary. I'm originally from Canada. And when I was growing up in the 80s, I was really lucky to be able to see a fellow named Håkan Loob, who it was, as you may know, one of the top ice hockey players, not just in Sweden, but in the National Hockey League. And at the time when I was growing up, he was playing for the Calgary Flames, and you know, we had a big stadium called the Saddle Dome where, you know, everyone would chant Loob. And I remember watching him play, and he was such a skilled player and so wonderful and agile to watch. And I kind of shared this story when I was speaking to the class about how I so enjoyed watching him and felt a little bit of an affinity to Sweden through Håkan Loob. And so it was exciting to be there. And then as Henrik was dropping me off at the train station, he said, "Oh, I just have to run an errand and, you know, go to the shopping mall," or something like that. And then and I was like, okay. And so we went to this building that looked nothing like a shopping mall. And we went in, and I was like, you know, what are we doing at the, you know, the ice hockey stadium? And we went up to the top floor, and Henrik said, "Les, I'd like you to meet Håkan Loob." And we ended up chatting probably for about, I don't know, 45 minutes or an hour. He was such humble individual, curious, I would say, highly intelligent, and it was such a pleasure to meet him. And the last part of this story, recently I've been doing a podcast, I'll share the link with you all, related to injury, our topic for today, and how to recover from injury. And I reached out to Stefan, who was kind enough to put me in touch with Håkan Loob, and I, you know, was able to do a podcast interview with him. It was really interesting to hear about his injury experiences. And just briefly, at one point in our discussion, he mentioned that he had 30 to 40 dislocated shoulders. And I said, "Was that over the course of your entire career?" And he said, "No, that was in the 86-87 season. In one season alone, he had 30 to 40 shoulder dislocations, and he just played through it. And then at the end of the year, he had a shoulder operation. And the following year, he was the first Swedish player ever to score 50 goals in a single NHL season." But I appreciated, and certainly relevant to our discussion today, he talked a lot about how he used psychological tools and strategies like imagery and imagining himself, seeing himself in different situations, and how he used that to help him increase his self-belief and also to kind of program himself so that he was well prepared in different situations. Anyway, all that to say, I have an affinity for Sweden, for the people of Sweden. And again, it's wonderful to be with you today. So thanks for taking the time to have me and to meet.
And thank you, Les. And I was just say, someday hopefully we'll get you here to Sweden. That's a goal for us.
That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna just start here with I'll post a few slides. Can everyone see the slides here? Oh, let me just share them. Are you able to view the slides? Maybe you can just give me a thumbs up.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I'll go through some slides, but as I say, I prefer to make it a little bit more discussion based. I'll probably stop at points and ask some questions. over the past, I guess, probably 30 or 40 years, there's been an increasing amount of research and awareness that when an athlete has an injury, it's much more than just a physical event, and something that can have a profound effect on their psychology, on their mental health and their well-being. It probably comes as no surprise to any of you that when an athlete gets hurt, they may experience a sense of loss, right? They lose something that's an important part of who they are. Maybe they lose interactions with people that are important to them, their teammates or coaches or significant others, that they no longer necessarily see in the same capacity because maybe they're removed and engaged in their rehabilitation. They may lose a sense of their ability just to engage in simple day-to-day tasks. Particularly if it's an acute injury and the athlete has gone from being high performing and well functioning to all of a sudden, being on crutches, or, maybe they had a significant operation. If, for instance, they tore an anterior cruciate ligament, which is a common injury in many sports, unfortunately, then they may be physically incapacitated. And so they experience a sense of loss over their ability to simply engage in once taken for granted tasks. Okay, so injury, there's a substantial body of research now, probably hundreds of studies that show that injury can have a big or profound psychological impact on the athlete. I'll just very briefly, not to be too self-indulgent here, but just talk a little bit about my background to give you a sense of kind of how I came to be, I guess, speaking in front of you today. I mentioned I'm originally from Canada, but years ago, I studied in Australia, in Perth, which is on the west coast on the Indian Ocean. As you can see from the photo, they have beautiful beaches there. And I was lucky enough to study with a fellow named Bob Eklund, who is a sport psychologist and who was my supervisor there. Prior to coming to Australia, I used to compete in amateur wrestling, which I know is not particularly popular in Sweden, and may conjure images of, steroided, hyper-masculine individuals breaking chairs over each other's heads and engaging in frivolous shenanigans. But the real sport of amateur wrestling is quite technical and very physical. And unfortunately, I in my participation, I had a lot of injuries. I tore my ACL 3 times and had it operated on. I had a shoulder dislocation, an elbow dislocation. I was probably in rehabilitation and physiotherapy more than I was actually competing. And as I say, personally, I found one of the most challenging things was that transition of coming back into training and competition. And all these sort of doubts and sort of what ifs, like, would I still retain my skills? Would I be able to compete at a high level? What impact would the injury have on my skill execution? So all of these kind of doubts and uncertainties. And I guess that led to my own personal interest in, first of all, understanding other athletes' experiences with injury and whether there were strategies that could be implemented to turn the challenge of injury into an opportunity, I guess, to experience what's often referred to as stress-related growth. In your own lives. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you shouldn't be modest now. Could you please tell us, you were the national champion in, wasn't that right?
So yeah, I was a junior national champion in Canada, and I competed at Simon Fraser University, which is in Vancouver, and we competed against other American schools in a division. It wasn't the NCAA, but as you may know, in the United States and in Canada, we have sport that's done through the universities, collegiate sport. And so I competed for Simon Fraser University. Yeah, as I mentioned, I was probably in rehabilitation, unfortunately, more than I was actually competing. But I found particularly this transition, kind of getting back into sport, was really difficult. And so that was kind of the focus of my doctoral work in Perth, which I started back in 2002. So shows you how old of a creature I'm getting to be here. Anyway, I studied at Perth in Western Australia, and I've since been very fortunate to work at a number of different places. On the left here is a photo of my first place of employment, a university called Karlstad University, which is located in the town of Bathurst, Australia. It's a smaller city outside of Sydney, which you probably know or have heard of. In 2011, I had the opportunity to work for several months at the German Sport University in Cologne, which was just wonderful, with a fellow named professor named Jens Kleinert. I worked for 3 years at Texas Tech, which was certainly an interesting experience in the western part of Texas. And for the past 10 years, the photo here on the bottom right-hand side is of Salt Lake City in Utah. And as you can see, it's nestled in the hills, and this is a picture of the campus. I often love to just go behind at the back of the university, and you can hike and just get into nature. And we have wonderful mountains. Thankfully, in a month, we'll have a new president, and I don't know if that makes travel to the US potentially more appealing, but Utah is quite a wonderful place, certainly in terms of the natural beauty, and if you love the great outdoors, skiing, or anyway, I'm happy to give you any travel tips if you're interested in coming to Utah. So that's a little bit about my background. As I mentioned, kind of my focus and my experience was an injury. This is my last point on myself here. The fellow on the right, his name was Daniel Ligali. He was a teammate of mine, and he became Canada's first world and Olympic champion. He was originally from Nigeria, and in 1994, he defected, I guess you could say. He was competing in what's called the Commonwealth Games. So Canada's part of the Commonwealth. When England was exploring the world and conquering the world, they were in control or had power over numerous countries, of course, India and other countries, including Canada. Daniel was from Nigeria, and then he stayed in Canada in 1994 after the Commonwealth Games, and he went on, as I say, to become a world and Olympic champion. He was an amazing wrestler, and it was pretty special to be able to train and compete with someone of his caliber. So anyway, enough about me. Just to give you a little bit of context for our discussion over the next couple hours or hour and a half here, I want to kind of give you a little bit of kind of background in terms of the research that's been done on the psychological aspects of injury. I'm just going to hide this here. One of the first areas that I'm going to talk a little bit about is, I know you're coaching, you're studying your master's in coaching, and so hopefully our discussion will be specific to things that you can do or influence as in your role as coaches. In this case, first of all, to be aware of some of the factors that increase the likelihood of injury. So this term antecedents refers to factors that come before, that precede, or that occur in advance of injuries. Often, we think of injury simply as bad timing or bad luck, but through research, we've identified some factors that seem to be related to a greater risk of injury, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Another area of research is focused on what happens in terms of how athletes respond once they do get hurt. So after they're injured, how does the athlete respond to the injury? And that may be important because, it's not surprising, I'm sure, that many athletes may have negative emotions. Unfortunately, if those negative emotions persist too much, that can have an impact on behaviors, right? So just to give you an example, think about when you did well in sport or on a test in school, or, maybe you really worked hard to do well in a job interview, and then you have that positive experience. what does that do for your emotions, right? Maybe you feel like a sense of like, I worked hard and it paid off. And, like you see, okay, I did really well in this class. And you're like, yes, right? Or, you perform really well in that sport or that athletic competition. And then it elicits or engenders positive emotions. And then think about how those emotions then impact your behaviors, right? So if you did well on the test and you feel those positive emotions, you're elated, you're excited, you're happy, what does that do for your subsequent motivation and your effort or persistence moving forward? You're probably more likely to put in energy, time to persist through difficulties. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about why it's important that as coaches that you understand how athletes may respond to injury so that you're in a better position to help or to facilitate their recovery. Okay, a third area of scholarship is focused on factors that influence the rehabilitation or the recovery and the return, the sort of rehabilitation. And there are numerous factors, right? Things like the extent to which athletes believe they are in control of their rehabilitation, what's referred to as locus of control. So if you have what is called an internal locus of control, where you believe that your actions make a difference to what happens to you in life, right? That you can assert influence over the outcomes that you intend to achieve, whether it's a return to sport, whether it's getting a degree in a certain job, whether it's, getting into a master's program at a good university, right? If you believe that you're in control of those events in your life, then that may impact, in this case, your rehabilitation or your recovery. Other factors like social support or confidence, right? Do you believe that you have the ability to overcome all of the challenges associated with a difficulty like an injury rehabilitation? Do you get the support that you need? Okay, there's a whole multitude of factors that have been looked at and a number of interventions that are really interesting that show that coaches and sports scientists and practitioners can enhance the likelihood that athletes do in fact make an effective recovery and a return to sport if in fact that's the goal of the athlete. The last area of research is what I alluded to earlier, where the athlete is trying to return to competition. So they're kind of at the final stages of their physical therapy or physiotherapy, and they're engaging in more sports-specific forms of training and eventually returning into competitive activities. Okay, and increasing research that shows that this transition may be difficult, and that just because athletes are physically ready does not necessarily mean they're psychologically ready to return. Okay, so all this, I guess, just to give you a little bit of context or background for the work that's been done in terms of the psychological aspects of injury. Okay, so I want to just talk a little bit about that first one, the antecedents or the precursors of injuries. We often think, when we're trying to attribute or understand, like, why is it that that injury happened, right? Like maybe you'll be watching a football match and, it's like, okay, well, why did Slotin get injured, right? Well, what happened? Was it just bad timing? Was he, in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or, was it just bad luck? Often we attribute injuries to those factors, but in reality, there's typically a specific cause of injury. Okay, those causes may be environmental in nature, right? As for the example here, maybe you're out for a nice ride with your training partners, and unfortunately, someone in the environment is not paying attention because they're eating a cheeseburger on their cell phone, putting on, makeup or whatever they're doing, or maybe they've imbibed too much alcohol. Whatever the case may be, there could be, perhaps more commonly, maybe there's rain or poor weather conditions and you're out training, right? And you slip and you fall because of factors in the physical environment. Okay, there could be biomechanical factors. I mentioned when I was studying in Australia, cricket, which you may not be entirely familiar with, is a very popular sport in Australia. England brought it to India and other countries that they colonized. And at our university, at the University of Western Australia, there was often studies with the cricket players, or what they call the bowlers, basically like the pitchers in baseball, right? And these guys, they sort of do this long wind up where they what's called bowl the ball in this overhand motion, and the ball goes at upwards of 90 miles an hour, like extremely fast, and they put a lot of force on their shoulder, right? And so the biomechanics, the way in which they go through that motion, can have an impact on whether they're likely to get repetitive kinds of injuries. There may be there may be anatomical factors. I mentioned this podcast, and one of my special guests was your professor, Professor Magnuson, and it was a pleasure to have him speak about his elite running career and his ascension to being one of the top runners in Sweden in a very short period of time. There may be anatomical factors, right, for runners, as an example of, maybe they're pronating, or how they, their running style in terms of their physical characteristics or their anatomical makeup that may increase the risk of injury. In our case, I guess the interest is, are there actually psychological factors? And typically, this isn't really an area that coaches or others necessarily think about as an area that may increase the likelihood that someone gets hurt. And so I want to talk a little bit more about the research that's focused specifically on psychological or even social factors. It's important to note that if you're trying to explain any phenomenon, whether in this case why someone got hurt, there's usually more than just one factor, right? It's usually a combination or a complex mix of different factors. Okay, the environment may interact with biomechanical factors, right? Or anatomical factors, right? Like maybe someone who's flat-footed and running on certain surfaces consistently, maybe that mixture then increases the likelihood that someone gets hurt. I want to focus in a little bit more, again, on the psychological factors and how they increase injury risk. Okay. Along with these psychological factors, there are also, I probably should have said psychosocial factors, because the environment plays an important part. And this is where you as coaches can be really aware of the culture and the norms that you promote. There's a sociologist by the fellow named Jay Coakley who talks about this idea, of the norms of the sport ethic. When I use the term norms, does anyone know what I mean? What does that term norms? What are norms? What are norms?
Någon som har koll på läget?
Hard to explain right off the bat, but sort of like the groundwork of what you usually do in a context or environment.
Okay, that's
something along those lines.
That's a great description, Daniel. That's awesome. The groundwork. So you're suggesting that norms, they're underlining what you do in terms of your actions or behaviors, right? They may be attitudes, beliefs, right? What's considered normal or acceptable, right? In the context of sport, there may be certain norms, attitudes, values, or accepted beliefs. Things like, if you're a real athlete, you don't stop if you feel pain or signs of pain, but you work through it. If you're a real athlete, you don't just strive to be decent, you strive to be the very best, and nothing less is acceptable, right? If you're a real athlete, you'll do whatever you can, if you're in a team sport, to help your team win no matter what the cost, because that's the goal of sport. Okay, Coakley would suggest that there's nothing necessarily wrong with these norms, right? There's nothing necessarily wrong with pushing, with striving to, achieve victory or to work through difficulties, for instance, when you feel pain. Certainly some of that is going to be part of sport or any challenging endeavor. What, however, can be problematic, according to Coakley, is when people uncritically, when coaches, for instance, uncritically accept these norms and embrace them wholeheartedly. So the coach may say, all right, if you're, on our team, I don't want to hear about whether you're experiencing pain. That's just something you have to accept. If that's the message you're saying, then it's probably going to be likely that if an athlete does experience some sort of discomfort, they're not likely going to disclose it to you or to others, because you as a coach are creating an environment where you're indicating that it's not acceptable to disclose pain, or you're creating a standard where the athlete has to work through that pain, or whether, the athlete may think, well, I'm going to get replaced on this team because my coach is really just interested in winning. They're not entirely concerned about me as a human being, in terms of the development of skills that I might get in sport. They're just curious, or they're just interested in winning because they're getting pressure from administrators, from other coaches. If you're at a professional level, maybe your job depends on it and you need to gain income to support yourself or your family. Okay, so these norms, which I've listed here, are can be critically important in the beliefs that athletes internalize. And when they believe, for instance, that it's important to be dedicated to the game no matter what, right? That they should strive for distinction, to be the very best. Again, I would never say to you, well, just strive to be mediocre. But on the other hand, maybe there's times where doing your best has to be good enough. And if that doesn't mean you're placing first, then that is okay, or that's perfectly legitimate. If, the messaging, if you as coaches are saying to athletes either explicitly or subtly, if you're saying that, well, they have to accept risks and play through pain, that's just part of sport, then they're more likely to engage in behaviors that may increase the likelihood that they actually get hurt. What's up, Jackie? I just need no worries.
Les?
Yeah.
May I ask a question?
Of course. Yeah.
Have there been any research done in that area that has looked at the sport parent in these concerns?
Yeah, that's a great question. And not as far as I'm aware specifically in relation to injury, but certainly there, I mean, and given your focus and your expertise in the area, that parents certainly contribute to the culture or the environment, right? And I know in your research, when you focus on the motivational climate, right, is the climate focused more on performance relative to how others are doing, right? This ego-oriented environment versus more of a mastery environment where parents, for instance, encourage their kids to do their best relative to themselves or to their previous performance, or to learn and master skills. I haven't, as far as I'm aware, seen any research that connects the climate that the parents foster or create and link that specifically to injury risk. But I think that would be really interesting, because just, theoretically, you'd think, well, if the parents are fostering this environment that's really performance oriented, they really want them to get on that football team or that floorball team, and that's what they're sort of creating that pressure, then again, maybe the kids would be more likely to not tell their parents if they're hurting, or if they're they don't want to disappoint them. So maybe they're not going to say, okay, well, I'm not going to speak to my parents openly if I'm not, I'm going to just push through. So I see that, yeah.
It would be interesting for us to take stance on have a look at that one. Perhaps we can discuss that later on. But it was just one thing that was crossing my mind when I heard you talk about that. So
well, I think that's great. And the idea here, of course, and as you're suggesting, Stefan, it's of course there's multiple individuals that could be relevant or salient in creating a culture or in an environment, whether it's coaches, parents, and so I guess the sort of larger point here is, particularly for all of you who are entering in or working as coaches, as leaders, as teachers, to be aware of your role in the environments that you are helping to create, right? Like anytime I hear someone say, well, that's just how sport is, it's like, well, no, it doesn't have to be any particular way. It first of all requires some critical consciousness or thought about how it is, and whether you as coaches or we as parents might want to do something different, or whether we see that there are aspects of sport that may be positive, but maybe there's other cultural elements or norms that are being fostered, endorsed, or perpetuated that may be less than optimal or less than healthy. And I think that's kind of the point that Coakley would make, is that if you go to the extreme of embracing these ideals, right, that there should be no limits in pursuit of the obstacles that you're trying to achieve, or that you don't sort of accept any limitations, right? That I'll just keep working harder, I'll just try again and again. That you need some of that mindset for sure if you're going to achieve in any achievement setting. But on the other hand, if it's always just about trying to push through a brick wall, in this case, maybe that's going to increase the likelihood that you get hurt. Any thoughts, comments? Do any of you see some of, it could be parents or coaches or others, have you come across these kinds of values or beliefs, any of the four that are listed here, as coaches yourselves, or when you interact in sport environments? Any personal experience, I guess, in experiencing some of these norms and the impact they might have on an athlete?
Elina, I was thinking of your team. Do you reckon yourself in this situation that he's talking about, that you as
absolutely
a coach? Yeah.
I work as a soccer coach in like a pretty high up in the leagues, and I can see that our athletes tend to not play or not say to us when they are in pain, because they don't want to lose their spot in the team and in the start and everything like that. So yeah, I see it quite sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, that's, Alina, that's I'd say, unfortunately, that's a great example that you mentioned, right? That, and that's, you may or may not be conveying to the players that that's something that they should be worried about, but that in some ways is also part of, I guess, the reality of competitive sport, right? If someone is hurt, the athlete is aware that someone will necessarily need to take their spot. But again, I think how you as a coach, or how you as coaches handle that situation and handle that athlete, can be really important, right? Like if you're sort of communicating to your athletes as a whole and saying, okay, well, if you're injured, you're done or you're out, or it's, if you're conveying messages that, well, I see how other athletes are treated when they're injured, and they're basically just guarded, or I can see that the coach doesn't really care or spend any time with athletes once they're hurt. I don't want that to be me. right? I'm going to make sure I just keep working through this, or I see that you're very quickly replaced and your chance of getting your spot back is very limited, right? So I think these are important self-reflection points to consider, and just to think about the environment that you may be in part creating or influencing as you're interacting with athletes in your teams or settings. So that was, yeah, thanks for sharing, Alina. Any other thoughts or comments on some of these kind of cultural norms or beliefs and how they may increase the likelihood of injury?
I was thinking of one thing. I think like the social aspect of it all is quite interesting, because not as a role as a coach, but as a role as a friend. I recently followed a close friend of mine who torn his ACL 2 times now. And the second time was because of the peer pressure of his football teammates, like, you should come and play with us again. But he probably should have needed a bit more rehabilitation before getting into the sport specific training.
Yeah.
But because of that he had such close peers in his team, he started playing too early and tore it again.
Yeah.
And he said that it was entirely because he felt that he needed to get back with the boys. So that was entirely very specific social pressure against him. And since all of us who have been close to him has followed his rehabilitation for 2 years now, he was of course very bummed when he tore it a second time.
Yeah.
But it was such an example of the peer pressure of it all coming back, not from the coach himself, but the peer pressure of coming back to sports.
Yeah.
Because you have, of course, have friends in the team.
Yeah, that's such an interesting example. And is it Felicia? Is that how I pronounce it?
Felicia, yeah.
Felicia,
It's
yeah.
very hard to pronounce it in English. I have noticed.
No,
Felicia, someday.
Yeah, so that's again like an unfortunate but a perfect example of what we're talking about here, right? And I think that's again a great point. It's not just parents, it's not just coaches, but teammates in particular may exert a tremendous amount of influence or unfortunately pressure on an athlete to return. And particularly in the case of a long-term injury, I actually just came across a study that said for youth athletes, if they come back after an ACL before 2 years, they're significantly more likely to tear their ACL for a second time. Well, the current time frames that athletes are given after an ACL is 9 to 12 months. This finding suggests maybe we should rethink the whole time frame. And if you have peers saying, oh, we need you back, right? Like you're a key part of the team, especially for youth athletes where they may be even more susceptible to some of those pressures, but not necessarily. Even at professional levels, there may be a lot of external pressure to return that the athlete, unfortunately, in this case, got hurt again. And maybe that pressure to return was part of that. They returned too soon. Those are all, thank you for sharing those examples. And again, I think, we of course want to reduce injury risk or likelihood. And so I think my take home message here for you would be to think about, again, as coaches and as significant individuals in the environment, to think about the messages that you are conveying to your athletes. And maybe if you think, okay, well, the athlete should take more time, because if they have to go through another ACL reconstruction and another long rehabilitation, in the end, it's just going to keep them out longer, or it's just going to do a disservice to them. And while there may be times where it's good to accept certain amount of risks or to work through certain pain, there may be other times where it seems like it's better to back off, where the athlete should be okay with doing their best and that not necessarily being first place or winning necessarily, but maybe they're still just improving on something. So I just want to talk a little bit about one other factor that's more psychological in nature that may increase the risk of injury, and that is stress. And back in 1998, or not, pardon me, 1998, Gene Williams and Mark Anderson. Mark Anderson is American and Swedish. He spent time at Halmstad University, where he's worked with Andreas Iverson and Urban Johnson. Maybe those names are familiar to you. They're coaches and researchers at Halmstad University. They've collaborated closely with Mark Anderson, and when he was doing some of his early work, Mark Anderson's mentor, Gene Williams, they developed a model called the stress athletic injury model that's been tested in a lot of research over the last 30 years that has shown that stress can actually increase athletes' risk of injury. So I want to just briefly sort of walk through and dissect this model so that you as coaches have an understanding of how stress can increase injury risk. And then I'm going to put up a questionnaire, and I've given a handout that has a number of sheets that I'm hopeful that you can use in a very practical way in your work with injured athletes. I'll come back to that assessment here in just a minute. The first thing that happens according to this model is that the athlete gets into a potentially stressful situation, and that word potentially is important. I want to talk a little bit more about that. Okay, at the other kind of end of this model is injury. So it's not the case that you can see, of course, there's this direct line between getting into a potentially stressful situation and getting hurt. The question is why is the situation only potentially stressful? And what is it about being in a stressful situation, or what's perceived or deemed to be stressful, that increases the likelihood that someone gets hurt? Okay, well, the first thing that Williams and Anderson talk about is what happens when people enter into different achievement or potentially challenging situations. It could be a difficult training session. Maybe you have to, the coach says, okay, I want you to run a mile and under in 5 minutes or less. Maybe that's the challenge. Or maybe you're in a situation where you're trying to get on to the team, right? It's like, I really want to get on this floorball team, but I'm not sure if I'll be able to do that. Or there's parents or people who are watching, and I want to make sure I impress them. Or it's the final competition, and you desperately want to win. Okay, the situation is only potentially stressful because, according to Williams and Anderson, it depends on how you appraise or interpret that situation. Okay, it's your cognitive appraisal, the thoughts that you have in relation to that situation, that will increase the likelihood that it's perceived as a threat or as a challenge. When we get into different situations, whether it's, try to make the team or, do that test of endurance, right? We make an assessment of two things. First of all, what is being asked of me in this situation? In other words, what are the requirements? Okay, well, I'm going in, it's the end of the semester, and there's a test with 150 questions that I need to answer. Or I'm going into a job interview, and there are certain demands or requirements in order to perform well in that situation. So you have some understanding of what are the demands, what's being asked of you in that circumstance, right? Like, okay, if I'm going to run a mile in under, in 5 minutes or 6 minutes or less, I have to be able to do certain things, right? Like, I need to pace myself. I need to go out hard, but then conserve energy in the middle, right? Like, you have some understanding or some sense of what's required in order to achieve that task. That's the first assessment. The second is your abilities, your sense about whether you can successfully meet those demands or not. Well, I know in practice I've been running really well, and I'm fit, and I've been training hard. So I believe, based on my training, my times in practice, that I can accomplish that. So I like to use sort of the analogy of a scale, right? On the one hand, you're making an assessment of what are the demands of the circumstance. And on the other hand, you're making an assessment or an appraisal of your ability to meet those demands, right? If you believe that, yes, I have the capabilities, I'm skilled, I've done this well in the past, that you believe you have the capabilities to meet the requirements or the demands of the situation, you're likely to interpret the situation as a challenge, one that you can successfully rise to the occasion and meet. On the other hand, if you believe that the demands of the situation are far greater or greater than your ability to meet those demands, right? And that inability, there's a disconnect between what am I being asked or what's required of me and what's my ability to meet those demands. If you believe that's the case, there's a disconnect, and that inability to meet those demands has negative consequences, right? If I don't run the mile in this time, then, I'm not going to get my place on the team. Or if, I don't do X, Y, and Z, then we're not going to win the game, right? If you believe that you do not have the ability to meet the demands of the situation, and that inability to meet those demands has negative consequences, then you're likely to experience the situation as a threat. Now, there's a few things that happen when we interpret or when we appraise situations as threatening. We experience what's called a stress response. And the stress response has two broad dimensions or facets to it. Okay, the first is what it does to our attention. Think about yourself in the example I gave a minute ago where you're in a test, right? Professor Agneson gives you this test at the end of the semester, and there's, 150 questions, and then maybe there's not a ton of time to complete the answers on the test. You only have, let's say, an hour and 20 minutes, right? And you're going through the test and you've maybe done like 75 questions, and Stefan says, okay, you have 20 minutes left. And then you're like, oh my goodness, right? Like, there's no way, right? You're like, 20 minutes left. I've, only completed 75 questions, and there's no way I'm going to complete these questions. If I don't complete the questions, I'm not going to pass or do well in the class. If I don't do well in this class, I'm not going to get my master's degree. If I don't get my master's degree, I'm not going to get my job. On and on and on, right? In other words, when we get stressed, we tend to get distracted. If I'm an athlete and I'm not immersed or absorbed in what I'm doing, if I'm having distracted thoughts like, oh, I missed that last pass, oh, I'm not going to make the team, right? If I'm not absorbed in what I'm doing, I'm more susceptible to getting hurt, right? Because my attention, I'm not absorbed in what I'm doing, okay? So that's one sort of element of the stress response is we tend to get distracted. We have task irrelevant thoughts when we appraise things in a threatening manner. Now, the other thing that happens from an attentional standpoint is actually that first bullet point here on the slide. We tend to get what's called a narrowing of the peripheral vision, right? In some sports, especially team sports, let's say basketball, floorball, football, where it's dynamic, right? I probably need to be able to see that, there's someone kind of coming in from the side. If I'm stressed, right, and I have what we call in what's colloquially or in everyday language called tunnel vision, right? If I can't see cues in the periphery or in the environment, then I'm more susceptible to getting hurt, right? Again, if I'm the soccer player and I can only look straight ahead because I'm so stressed, right? I may fail to see that defender who's coming in to tackle me from the side, right? In other words, I need to have sensitivity to cues in the peripheral environment. That's a key element of expert performance. Maybe you've had times where you had too much to drink. I'm not a huge drinker, but the last time I had too much to drink, I remember sort of like wobbling my way. All I could see was that bathroom, like 15 feet ahead of me. There could have been a rhinoceros or an elephant coming from the side. I would have been completely oblivious to it because I had drinking too much beer. So the same thing happens, right? Like maybe you've had experiences yourself where all you can see is sort of straight ahead. Again, in some tasks, particularly in dynamic sports, you want the athlete to be able to take in cues in the environment, and an inability to do so can elevate their risk of injury. Okay, the last thing that happens here in this, the last thing in terms of the stress response is there's a physical component, right? Let's just say I stopped and said, okay, I'm going to pick out two of you and I'm going to ask you to sing the Swedish national anthem to the rest of us. Now, I don't know, maybe some of you were like, I love to sing. And I was hoping our guest speaker would ask me to sing the Swedish national anthem because I haven't been able to do that for a long time. And now I get the opportunity, right? Maybe you feel like, well, I love to sing. I sing in the shower. I sing in my, when in the singing group that I go to. So for you, maybe you feel like you have the skills and abilities to meet that demand, right? To sing well in front of your classmates, right? On the other hand, for some of you, maybe you feel like, well, no, I don't have those capabilities, right? My pitch and tone is not optimal. The last time I was at karaoke, it sounded terrible, right? And so you interpret that request as a threat. Now, let me ask you this. If I was to put one of you on the spot, right, and to say, okay, I'm going to ask, Alina, I want you to sing the national anthem. What might happen to someone when they interpret a situation as threatening? There's something that you can notice physically that changes very quickly. And I'll give you a hint. It tends to happen in their face. Something that you can see visibly when someone feels threatened by the circumstance. What happens to them on a physical level? They tend to, something in the face changes. You think?
Vet vad man pratar om, eller? You know what he's talking about?
Maybe you get you lose all color and you like, you look like a deer in headlights, so to speak.
Yeah, you got it, Felicia. I think, so often people blush, right? Or maybe, like they get very red and their cheeks get rosy quickly, right? And you can see sometimes that can happen almost, I wouldn't say instantaneously, but very quickly, right? And so, sorry, I just realized, hang on one sec here. I'm not sure if I paused the recording. Oh, I think I'm still recording here. Sorry. I just wasn't sure if I continued the recording. Anyway, like you see physically when someone's experiencing threat or believing they don't have the abilities to handle the circumstance, that they may, there's these physical changes, right? So if the athlete, for instance, feels like they're in that circumstance, then maybe they get a dry mouth. Maybe their muscles tense. Maybe they start feeling uneasy in their stomach. Maybe they fatigue quicker and their timing and coordination is reduced. If all of that happens, it's not hard to imagine that someone is more susceptible to getting hurt. Okay, so all this to say that when the athlete perceives threat, that they are more susceptible to this stress response that has the attentional components and the physical consequences, both of which elevate the risk that someone gets hurt. Okay, just quickly, I don't want to get too much into the other components, but within this framework, there's also acknowledgement that people have a life going on, right? Like you're all, busy. Maybe you're trying to work through the demands of COVID, or maybe you've had, like you're moving to a new city, or you're taking a new job, or, maybe you had a bad fight with a significant other, and then you show up to practice and the coach tells you, okay, we're going to do this really hard training session. Well, all of the things that are happening in your life can influence how you interpret that discrete or that specific situation that you may enter into. right? You also tend to cope in certain ways, right? Like maybe, you have well-rehearsed or well-practiced deep breathing exercises that you use, or you're very skilled at just giving yourself one or two statements to build your confidence as you get into different situations that maybe reduces the likelihood that you interpret whatever situation you enter into as a threat. The other thing is you all have personality traits or attributes. Maybe some of you are easygoing. Maybe some of you like to perform. Maybe some of you, on the other hand, are more shy or introverted. Maybe some of you are neurotic, or you have what's referred to as type A personality, right? Where you tend to experience maybe anger or frustration, or you worry about things. Okay, if that's the case, then all of those characteristics that you bring with you to the circumstance or situation are going to likely influence how you interpret whatever circumstance you find yourself in. Okay, so all of these things interact. Who you are as a person, your personality, the things that are happening in your life, what's the history of stress, and how you tend to cope. All of that interacts in some way to influence how you interpret potentially stressful situations and the likelihood that you're going to experience the stress response and to get hurt or not. Okay, now, as researchers, as coaches, there's skills, whether it's breathing or relaxation or imagery or helping people to think about situations in different ways, right? That may influence their stress response and likelihood of injury, right? I don't know, we could spend, I used to give a class on the psychology of sport injury that lasted a whole semester, 15 weeks, and each week we would meet for 3 hours. So, we could go into a lot, there's in each of those 4 areas I mentioned, we could go into a lot of different directions. But in terms of skills, I want to kind of move a little bit more in that direction, because I know you're, again, coaches, and I want to offer some sort of practical tools to help you, in this case, assess whether someone might be experiencing a high level of stress. Okay, so on that note, let me just change my screen here, and I want to pull up another document. Okay, so in the handout that I gave you, can everyone see this new handout here? You got it? Yeah, okay.
And I just wanted to make sure that I also want to tell them that this paper you will get afterwards. You can get less presentation and also this document, so you know that. So I'll put that in Canvas. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a questionnaire, and it's called the Social Readjustment Rating Scale, and it basically is a tool that can give you, as a coach or as a leader, a sense of someone's risk of getting injured or ill. Now, remember, in the model, there was a suggestion that the history of stress, what's happening in your life, may increase the likelihood that you interpret certain situations as threatening. I actually, in one study, I mentioned Andreas Iverson and Urban Johnson. I was fortunate to collaborate with them on a study that we did with elite football players, and we looked at factors that increase their injury risk. And one of the factors that we found was that there was a link or an association between individuals who are experiencing higher life stress or a history of stress and their risk of injury. And this was the scale that we used as part of the study to measure their history of stress. Okay, so you can see it says the idea is to simply add up the values for all of the listed events that have occurred to you within the past year. So it says if a particular event has occurred to you more than once within the last 12 months, multiply the value by the number of occurrences. So unfortunately, if you have the death of a spouse or a partner, if you know, I guess in that case, I mean, this is a bad joke, but I don't think polygamy is allowed in Sweden. But if you have multiple partners, right, and they both unfortunately pass on in the span of a year, let's say you had two, then you would multiply that by two, right? Or, you know, maybe within the course of a year, you get married and, you know, and then you get divorced and then you get married again and divorced again. That's, you know, not good. Then you would multiply that by two, or by the number of times you were divorced. Okay, so the idea here is you simply, if that's something you've experienced, you simply mark that number down. Okay, you can see there's a lot of different events here, whether it's being fired at work or things that could be stressful or that many people find are particularly stressful. So the idea is you just go through and have the athlete or you yourself score yourself on each of these things. And then it says to give yourself the total at the bottom. Now, here's the important part. It says if you score 300 or more, statistically, you stand an almost 80% chance of getting sick or, in our case, injured in the near future, right? If you score 150 to 299, the chances are about 50%. Less than 150, about 30%. And the summary statement here at the end is that this scale or questionnaire seems to suggest that change in one's life requires an effort to adapt and then an effort to regain stability, right? As coaches, it's important, of course, to know your athletes, to have a sense of what's happening in their life. You might just on occasion ask them to take a minute or two and go through something like this. What it does then is it gives you some information. Well, okay, my athlete, geez, they scored over 300. They scored, you know, 375. Maybe, you know, we should just back off on a little bit of their training, or maybe at least I should have a conversation with them, because I don't want them, you know, if I give them a hard training session, I don't want that to then become the breaking point at which they do then get hurt because they have all these other things happening in their life. Okay, so this is just used as a tool, and there are numerous others that you could use, but again, Stefan, as you mentioned, will share that with you. Okay, there's a lot of other materials, and I know we're not going to have time today, but I just, in this document that you'll get, there's other sort of exercises that, you know, I'm more than happy if you want to email or communicate with further, or if you need any further explanation about how to use any of these tools, they're there to help you in a practical way, okay? So on that note, I guess any specific questions or comments on this particular tool, or any issues there? No, okay. So again, the idea here, there's now probably, I'm trying to think how many studies, at least I would say 75, if not more studies that have in some way implicated stress or a history of stress as a risk factor for injury. And so I think it's important, I would say, for you as leaders to at least be aware of the stress maybe that you're experiencing, or the athletes of those you're working with.
Excuse me, Les.
Yeah.
Has there been any other lists, kind of this one, but more like sport related in lists, like more like you've been unselected from team, or you have been having a hard time with your coaches like this? Is there any stuff like that?
That's a great question. I'm off the top of my head, I'm not sure. There might be. I suspect there are, but I think like part of why a scale like this might be used even in an injury context, again, is sort of this acknowledgement that you know there are for sure sport related or sport specific stressors, that an athlete may be experiencing, or that may be more specific to an athlete. But that it's also important to realize, of course, that an athlete is a human being, and that they, experience stress that may be related to their sport, as you mentioned, but that certainly that stress could go beyond. And that it's, I think, important, I guess, to have some awareness of what's happening in their life, not just in sport, but outside as well. So
it aligns very well with the theme in this course, this holistic coaching. So it's about that. So I think it's really important to have this to consider these aspects. But also curious if there is something, if you'd like to have this one and also add this more specific, there were a similar scale, but for a team or something like that. I was just curious, but I'm going to
have to, that's a great question, Stefan. I'll have to, you've got me curious now myself, and I'll have to have a look and see. But I think, maybe combining those two, so you have some sense of, well, are they worried about sport related things, or maybe there's other factors beyond sport that are of relevance.
But anyhow, it's about how you interpret these stresses. So it depends. If you have a marital separation with a partner who was devastated to be in that relation, then it's a perfect way to get rid of them. So I mean, that's how we interpret this. So
well, exactly. Like maybe if you were unfortunately if you're separating, then it suggests the relationship wasn't particularly healthy. Maybe, again, I think you're right. A lot of it comes down to interpretation. Maybe you're happy to be out of it, and that's not necessarily a stress, but a source of significant relief.
But I think anyhow, if you're ending a relationship, even if it's a good relationship and a bad relationship, it will be stressful in any way. So I think it's a good general scale, I think, and that's been proven in a lot of studies. So I don't think it could be used in a good way.
Well, and I think the point you just made, in some ways, like while there is something to be said for how one interprets something, as you also implied, maybe there are certain circumstances that are just like in and of themselves are inherently kind of stressful, right?
For
even
sure.
if it's a bad relationship, then and maybe there's some relief, but there's also, like, as you said, separating is not a pleasant experience necessarily, right? So, great thoughts.
And just for comparison, to be deselected from a team isn't always, I mean, okay, you could say, oh, I have some spare time, but mostly you're thinking that it's a bad case. So we'll have a look at that. Perhaps we can do that together. And
well, these are great ideas, right? Like, I think I'll have to check and follow up on your question about, I'm sure there must be, I would think, a scale about like sport specific stressors, and and maybe that if you have a scale like that, then maybe that has greater predictive validity for when you're trying to predict whether someone gets hurt, because maybe for the athlete, if sport is really very important or consuming to them, maybe it's these sport stressors that are most likely to predict their risk of getting hurt, and maybe less some of these other life factors.
Perhaps added those two scales.
So those are awesome thoughts.
I think it's I would like to just add that I think it's very interesting either way, and just sort of the staggering numbers of the relation between stress and injury. I would say most coaches actually probably are not aware of this. Even if you go to elite coaches, I think most people just go about their work and don't really necessarily think about these kind of factors.
Well, I think that's a really important point, Daniel. And I guess just to be clear, like if we're thinking of like what accounts for injury, and you think of all the different factors, let's think of it as a pie, and you sort of separate out the different factors. I wouldn't say that stress is the biggest or strongest predictor or the biggest piece of the pie. Some of those other factors, like physical factors, would certainly occupy a large part of it. But as you're suggesting, Daniel, there's also certainly a portion of that pie that is related to stress. And I agree with you that most coaches wouldn't necessarily even think about that.
No,
And
that's what I
that's
mean.
where, yeah, they wouldn't necessarily even consider it. And so that's where, I always love teaching. I mean, I think that's, I love to get the chance to meet with you, because all of you are going to be out there. You are working with individuals. And then this is like a chance to translate what we know from research and convey that to bright, smart, intellectual individuals like yourself who go out and then hopefully use that knowledge in some way. And again, I think that kind of comes back to the earlier point about, you're part of the environments that you interact in. And when you're equipped with more knowledge, or you think, oh, well, I remember when that Canadian guy was babbling on about stress and injury, well, something stuck. And then you think, okay, well, maybe it's something that I should consider that previously I hadn't even given any thought to.
Yeah.
Awesome. That's a great point. Other thoughts on some of this injury risk? Okay, so let me just go back here. Can you see, I'm still, after months, trying to figure out all this Zoom stuff still. Let me just, okay, so we've gone through this social readjustment scale that I mentioned. Feel free to use it, or maybe it's helpful as a conversation piece with your athletes. Again, it's a tool for you to use. We're not going to get through all 4 of those areas that I mentioned in terms of the precursors or antecedents, which we just talked about. The second area relates to this response. The third were factors related to rehabilitation, and fourth to the return to sport. Again, I mean, we could have multiple classes on, or a class easily on each of these topics. Yeah, let's keep going here. Do we have a bit more time, Stefan? I'd love to go into a little bit more.
Yeah, we can take a break in 7 minutes,
Okay.
or something like that. Then we have to take a 5 or 10 minutes break, and then we continue. Is that okay?
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so the second area I wanted to touch on is this period where the athlete has gotten hurt. And it probably comes as no surprise to you that for most athletes can be a very frustrating period, right? Like, again, maybe if the injury was acute or if it happened suddenly, that they went from being high functioning to being very low functioning or incapacitated, or, they're stopped in their tracks of competing and achieving their goals. And so, a fair bit of research has been devoted to looking at this period when athletes in the immediate aftermath, like once they get hurt. This is a quote. You may, of course, recall the player David Beckham, who at one time was one of the top footballers in the world. And this quote is actually from his father. His father was interviewed. Beckham broke bones in his foot. This was before, I think, the World Cup in, was it 2002? I may be off on the year. Anyway, he broke a bone in his foot, and the reporter was speaking to his father, and his father, Ted Beckham, said the following. He said, "David called me from the hospital just to let me know how he was," the player's father, Ted Beckham, said. To be honest, he was devastated. He was very, very upset, and he said he was in a lot of pain and that he was in plaster. He said he was more upset because of what games were coming up. I feel really sorry for him. It's a really terrible thing to have happened, but fingers crossed he'll be okay. Okay, there's countless examples where athletes indicate that they are highly emotional, that they're frustrated, maybe they feel devastated or even hopeless. about their prospect of maybe coming back and competing in a certain competition, or being able to meet all of the many challenges and demands of an injury recovery. Okay, so I guess before we come to a break, I've posed this question: why, for you as coaches, or for us as practitioners, why should we bother to understand how an athlete responds to an injury? Like, who cares? Don't, okay, big deal. They get angry, so what? Well, I want to offer a few reasons here, and hopefully we have time when we come back. I want to actually get into one study. I think I've put it in the slides here, that relates to imagery, that shows just how powerful a technique like imagery can be in influencing the mind and body, or the recovery from rehabilitation, from injury, pardon me. Okay, so the first point here is that it's important to understand how athletes respond if you, as a coach, want to be in a good position to facilitate their adjustment or their coping. Again, it's kind of the point that you just made before, or just a second ago, Daniel. If you have clarity that, okay, well, there may be individual differences based on how the athlete appraises the injury and factors that influence those appraisals, then that understanding or that knowledge may influence how you interact with the person, the advice, the information, what you do or don't do. Okay, if you want to be in a position to facilitate coping, it's important to understand some of the ways in which athletes are likely to, or they may adjust or respond. Okay, I alluded to this second point previously, and that's that our reactions, your thoughts and your emotions influence your behaviors, right? In psychology, those are sort of three main areas we're interested in: thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, right? And if you're thinking, well, this is the worst thing that ever happened to me, there's no way I'm going to be able to recover in time, you're probably going to have negative emotions, right? Maybe you'll feel depressed, sad, angry. If that's the case, you may not think, well, those emotions may have a negative impact on your behavior. What a cutie pie. Right? If you, on the other hand, maybe there's some initial frustration, but then you shift, or you're able to sort of say, okay, well, yeah, this is frustrating. This sucks, but it happened. I can work through this, or I've come through challenges before, right? Then those thoughts will probably also impact your behavior. Maybe you'll think, well, it's worth putting in the time and effort into this rehabilitation. You'll put in energy when you show up to the rehabilitation, right? You'll engage in what we call adherence, or you'll comply to the prescribed program that your physiotherapist gives you. Okay, so in short, it's important that we understand how athletes respond, because thoughts influence emotions, and emotions can be very, very powerful drivers or initiators of our behavior, not just in injury rehabilitation, but in anything in life. The last point here is that there's an important or powerful connection that science is increasingly revealing, that looks at what happens when we experience stress or frustration. How does that impact us on a physiological level? Okay, and again, if maybe after we take one more break, I definitely want to highlight this one study that looks at imagery and how it can actually affect what's happening. Just the act of imagining yourself closing and contracting your arm in this one study was found to offset or reduce the loss of muscle strength. So there's this connection that, again, research is showing that, when you're stressed, for instance, you have high levels of cortisol. That can impact blood flow. And when you are injured, you need blood flowing to that injured area to promote healing. There are, if you take classes in like physiology, then you have an understanding of, what's happening sort of on a neurochemical level. But again, there's that intimate connection between mind and body, right? We often separate them, but that's really kind of a false separation, because what's happening in your mind is influencing what's happening in your body on a neurochemical level, and those processes influence your healing capacity. Okay, so if the athlete is really stressed, after a while, that may have a negative impact on their body's ability to heal. And of course, for many athletes who are injured, the first question they ask is, when can I get back and start competing? How long will this take? Right? So those are a few reasons why, as coaches, it's important to be well positioned or to understand the impact of responses on things like coping behaviors and physiological processes. All right, if we want to take a break, or we can do that, and then I want to just give you, I wish in some level I have lots of stuff, but I know I don't want to get too carried away here. So
yeah, we talked about that just before you arrived. That is important to be enthusiastic as a coach, as you are as a teacher. So we just sucking it all in, and it's lovely to hear you talking and speaking like that.
I had mentioned, and I'm kind of skipping forward here a little bit in my slide deck, but I mentioned this point that, injury, there's that mind-body connection. And I want to highlight one study in particular that I think is really interesting, that kind of demonstrates that connection. And it's just really an example of the kinds of tools that you as a coach can implement with your athletes, or physiotherapists or other practitioners can implement in easy, simple ways to help the athlete recover effectively, or to help them have a positive adjustment or response to their recovery. So let me just hide this here. Often in the case of a musculoskeletal injury, the goal of rehabilitation is generally to help the athlete regain muscle strength and function. So if they've torn a ligament in their knee, as you probably know, a lot of the rehabilitation efforts are to help the athlete sort of regain that, maybe there's a lot of atrophy in the muscle. I know after I had ACL surgeries, I remember my knee was swollen like a balloon, and my quadricep muscles shriveled to nothing, and it happened very quickly, and it was quite demoralizing. So a lot of physiotherapy in the case of musculoskeletal injury is designed to regain that muscle strength and function. Now, often, going to the photo here of Stefan back in his earlier days, the focus is on the role of muscle mass or other muscle mechanisms in understanding or in trying to improve muscle strength and muscle function. The focus, as I say, is on muscle mass. But what researchers or others tend to overlook is the role of the nervous system, in particularly an area of the brain that's called the primary neocortex. In this particular study that I'm going to talk a little bit more about, Brian Clark and his colleagues wanted to look at the role of the cortex, the neocortex, as a key determinant of muscle strength or weakness. They also wanted to look at the role of the nervous system in what's referred to as voluntary activation. Voluntary activation reflects the nervous system's ability to fully execute or incite to initiate muscle movement. And it's been shown that voluntary activation is reduced or compromised after experimentally induced weakness of muscle. Okay, so in this study, the researchers hypothesized that the neocortex would play an important role or determinant in mitigating or reducing the loss of muscle strength. So let me talk a little bit more about what happened here in this particular study. Okay, what they did, the researchers recruited 29 individuals, and they had these individuals casted. They put their arm from the elbow to their wrist in a cast. Okay, they were immobilized for 4 weeks. Okay, then they had a second group of healthy controls. So these were individuals who were perfectly healthy and they received no immobilization whatsoever. Now, of this first group of the 29 individuals, 14 of those were immobilized and they completed 5 sessions per week of imagery. In each of those 5 sessions, or in each of the sessions, what they asked the participants to do was simply to imagine themselves contracting the muscles in their arm and their wrist 52 times. Okay, so they didn't actually contract anything. They were given the explicit instruction of just imagining themselves contracting the muscles in their arm 52 times. They did that 5 times per week. Okay, so again, there were 3 groups. The group that had the arm immobilized that did no imagery, the healthy controls that had no immobilization, and the third group that had the immobilization plus they did the imagery. Okay, now what they did was they measured their wrist flexor strength using a torque motor task. So they gave them this task to measure their wrist flexor strength, and they assessed voluntary activation using an electrical stimulation device or procedure. Okay, so those were the 2 things they were interested in. What impact does the imagery have on this wrist flexor strength and voluntary activation? Again, the nervous system's ability to execute muscle. Okay, they measured these 2 things at 3 time points. The first was at baseline, so before anyone had been immobilized in the cast. Okay, then they measured them immediately after the 4-week intervention period, after the 4 weeks of immobilization, and then they measured them 1 week after recovery. So the 2 groups that had their arms immobilized, their arms were taken out of the cast, and then again they measured voluntary activation and this wrist flexor strength 1 week later. Okay, now I want to just take some time and try and orient you to this table here. Okay, you can see the immobilization group, or the group again that just has their arm immobilized but does not do the imagery. They're represented by the clear circles. Okay, the control group are the black circles, the dark circles. Again, a healthy group, no immobilization whatsoever. The third group was the immobilization group that did the imagery, and they're represented by the open triangles, the clear triangles. Okay, now recall I said they measured, in this case, this graph looks at their muscle strength, right? And you can see their scores from 0 being no strength to 30 being the top amount of strength in this particular group. You can see that at the beginning, before any of the groups had their arms immobilized, they were all equivalent in terms of their muscle strength. They were all in and around like 23 or 24 units of muscle strength. That's what you would expect, right? And that's what you would hope for, given that, again, none of these groups have had any immobilization. So what it suggests is they're all similar at the starting point before they've had their arms casted. Now, let's look at this. Let's look at the second time point after the 4 weeks. Okay, if you look at the control group, these are healthy individuals, but I should mention they're being told not to really engage in any kind of exercise, but just to sort of carry on their day-to-day life, but they're not engaging in any kind of strength training. So over the 4 weeks, there's a slight decline in the control group's muscle strength, almost negligible. And let's look, however, at this immobilization group. You can see the clear circle group here. They start off at like 23 or so units of muscle strength, and they come down all the way to basically 12 12 on the muscle strength scale. In other words, their muscle strength, they've lost about 50% of their muscle strength over the period where their arm is immobilized. Now that makes sense. Their arm is atrophying because they're not able to use it or to move the arm, right? It's in a cast. Okay, now what's very interesting is if we look at this imagery group, you can also see that they too had a decrease, but it was only about half the loss of muscle strength of the immobilization group, right? They went from about 23. Their strength only dropped to, let's say, what is it, about 17 points or 18 points. Okay, in other words, the mere act of imagining yourself contracting mitigated or reduced the loss of muscle strength by almost 50%. That's a lot, right? Like if I'm a coach and I say to my athlete, okay, I just want you to imagine your leg contracting, right? Like, because again, unfortunately, when you have an operation or you're unable to use that limb, the muscle can go extremely quickly. And that's what you want to reduce. You want to, of course, keep that muscle active so that it helps the athlete recover in not just a timely way, but also effectively. Just having them imagining their muscles contracting in and of itself may be a powerful tool for reducing the loss of muscle strength. Okay, now let's look at this, the findings related to voluntary activation. Again, voluntary activation is the nervous system's ability to activate muscle, and it was shown in a number of studies that it's reduced or compromised when you, for instance, put people in a cast or you induce weakness in that area. Okay, again, you can see if we look here at the time one, before they're in the cast, all the groups are relatively similar in terms of their nervous system's ability to activate muscle. They're all relatively high. Okay, again, the healthy controls, their level basically stays the same. That's essentially what you would expect because they haven't had any immobilization. A similar pattern happens when we look at the immobilization group. Their level goes from about like 95% to 75%, right? They've had like a 25% reduction in their voluntary activation. That's not good. That's not what you want. Okay, but on the other hand, the imagery group is having, they're also having a decrease, but you can see if you compare the imagery group here with the immobilization group, again, it's almost 50% less of a reduction in voluntary activation. In other words, just imagining is still helping the brain to send signals to that muscle to activate it. Okay, so this suggests that the nervous system may play a very active role in reducing the loss of muscle strength and in maintaining the mind's or the body's ability to activate muscles, to stimulate and fire those muscle nerves and neurons. So I love this study because I think it shows that, again, there is this important connection between the mind and the body. It doesn't take a lot to have an athlete imagine their muscle contracting. By doing that, that's one tool amongst numerous that we could go into that may be useful in terms of helping the athlete with their recovery. Again, I think these studies are really neat because to me, they show that even just small, simple modifications or changes, right? Like if someone is lying on a physiotherapy table, right? It's not hard to have them, imagine muscle contracting, or to maybe get them involved in a breathing exercise where the cortisol, the levels are being lowered, and maybe that promotes blood flow to their injured area. Again, we don't necessarily have time to go into all of or numerous strategies, but whether it's breathing or sort of relaxation, I'm happy to share information with you about scripts that you could use, or exercises that you can use with athletes to help them, in this case, engage in imagery or other kind of strategies to help facilitate their positive response and then hopefully their recovery.
I just have a question about this imaginary method. Like, do you know, is it a common thing to study, or is there many studies that has done similar things that they have done?
Yeah, so there are a number of studies specifically looking at imagery in the context of injury rehabilitation, and fairly consistently they are showing that imagery can be helpful for things like pain management. So like there's a lot of maybe physical pain or even psychological pain after an injury, and so imagery can be used in different ways. Maybe it's as I mentioned with Hawk and Lube, where you're sort of seeing yourself performing skills that you can't physically do because you're hurt, right? Or maybe it's coping with, I'm worried about going into the situation where I got hurt initially, and I want to see myself not being hesitant in that circumstance. And so, I can physically, I can't do it right now, but I can imagine it countless times. So yeah, there's a growing body of studies showing that imagery can be used to help injured athletes in different ways, whether it's manage their pain, or there's a technique called healing imagery, where the physiotherapist might give the athlete a very clear picture of what's happened, right? So it's like if they tore the ACL, maybe you show them a picture of a healthy ACL ligament, and you see, okay, the ligament runs right through sort of the joint here, but you can see that on the MRI, yours is frayed, right? It looks like a broken string, right? And what I want you to imagine is all of those frayed pieces gluing or bonding together, right? And so you help create a picture of what's happened to them, so they understand the nature of the damage or the structural damage that's been done. And then maybe you give them, specific things that you want them to imagine, so that improves healing. There's studies showing that healing imagery, as it's referred to, can actually promote healing in the body. So, excuse me. Sorry. So yeah, there's a number of studies now beyond just this one that have shown that imagery can be helpful. There was one, I had a previous slide here, I can just scroll up here, where a woman named Deborah Kupal and Britton Brewer, he's done a lot of research in the area of injury recovery. They found in one experimental study that using relaxation and imagery, often you use relaxation to get people in sort of the right frame of mind before you get them to imagine something, and that they found that helped reduce pain, and it actually increased strength in the injured area. And again, they suspected that there were probably some neurological things happening in terms of the imagery and why it actually increased strength in the injured area. That's I guess what I was just showing with this last study, right? It's not just muscle mass, for instance, that we often look at as important determinant of muscle strength, but there may be something specifically just in our brains and our nervous systems that are responsible for this effect. So that's a great question. Yeah. Other questions, or again, there's a lot of or numerous kinds of strategies that could be employed, and I guess my aim was just to give you like a sample or a little bit of a flavor for the kinds of things that you might do or use. I know one class doesn't necessarily, you can't do it the topic justice, but yeah, hopefully you've been given a little bit of food for thought, if nothing else, about some things to consider, and ways that you as coaches can reduce the likelihood that someone gets hurt, or maybe it's by being aware of, well, they're stressed and I need to back off their training, or to be thinking or consider about the culture that you're involved in influencing or impacting, or even just awareness that there are that psychological factors, and how athletes respond impact their recovery, and that you play an important role in providing strategies and providing support that can make a big difference to how the athlete recovers. Yeah.
Well, it sure is an interesting area, and it's, as you said, you can easily have a whole course of this theme. So probably next year we'll have you on several occasions. I think we have to have a separate course with you, Les.
Well,
and I think the most of the students agree that it's a very interesting area, and it's been a lot of interesting research that we would like to listen more to. So it's a pity that we don't have so much time, but it's been very interesting, and I think I speak for all the students too, and I think it was a perfect time and a perfect lecture, and hopefully, as you said, you can bring some stuffs to your own area of coaching. And just to let someone in, is there anyone who has any specific question to Les about everything that he's spoken to you with? Is there any?
Well, one thing. Go ahead.
I just found it interesting the way you're talking about being aware of the culture that you're in, going back to the norms that you talked about, the sport norms. I just found myself all the time going back to my own sport, ice hockey, which is my sport, and the fact that I think those norms are pretty much, in a nutshell, traditional hockey tough culture.
Yeah.
And I think that we've seen some change during the last few years, or going back a few years. There has been some positive change, but I definitely think it's a slow process, and I think that probably goes for other sports as well. But I can really recognize hockey in that sense.
Yeah. Well, it most definitely. I think. Excuse me. Hockey is notoriously a sport where, it's a hard physical sport, right? And there's also kind of that mindset, I think, or as you suggest, that culture of being tough and, helping your team. And again, I'm just thinking as you were talking, Daniel, about my discussion with Hawk and Lube, and I'll send Stefan, or he may have the link already, but I think you'd be maybe interested in watching some of these interviews and discussions. He talked about, how he had a concussion, probably numerous, but he relayed one anecdote where he had a concussion, and just this was in the 80s, and he said, well, we didn't really know much about concussion like we do today, right? And it happens a lot, unfortunately, in hockey. And he said, like, a couple days later, he was back on. And he said, nowadays, I probably would have been out for at least 10 days or 2 weeks, but we didn't really know better back then. And he talked about how, he said, I think like the culture is changing a little bit. And I was kind of asking him some questions about, like, is there that mindset in hockey of, being tough, of not showing weakness, and I think he acknowledged that there is and was and is, but that's changing a little bit, and from his standpoint, changing, I guess, for the better, because you're not, if you're always just trying to get the players back in quickly, then that, especially if you have a star player or whatever, they may be out just as quick as they're back in, and that's not really helping the team either. And so he talked about, there's more awareness of the need to take some time to not do an athlete a disservice and just rush them back in, but to make sure that they're, physically, mentally more ready to go. So yeah, great point.
I thought from my side, it would be very interesting to read more articles regarding this. So if you might have some favorite papers or published studies that you could maybe share with Stefan or us indirectly through Canvas, it would be very interesting to get a hold of them, because sometimes in the jungle of research, it's hard to find yourself. So it would be very interesting if you could drop some to Stefan that we could read about.
For sure. Well, yeah, I'm more than happy to do that. And I think that's a really good point. Like, as a field grows, sometimes it's hard to know where to start but yeah, I'm happy to share some papers, or I can also share my email address too, if any of you want to just contact me directly, or, please. I guess one of the things I love about this job is you get to meet different people, and you all have experiences and ideas, and just the comments you've made I think show your insight and the fact that you're thinking, and like, you've made wonderful comments. So I think that speaks to your abilities, and I'd encourage you to continue doing that, to continue to be curious. I'm happy to share any information, sure.
Yeah, and if any one of you would like to do some studies when you come to that point of the course, then I'm sure that Les will be can help you in some way to find some good research and like that. So just tell us, and of course we will do that, Felicia, and we'll put out some good suggestions from Leslie on Canvas, and also perhaps there are some interesting book chapters that you have written with some colleagues that perhaps will sum up some stuffs too, I think.
Yeah, just one other thought, Stefan, if I could quickly, I think part of why I find, like, more and more, I guess I just think injury is kind of a metaphor for difficulty or challenge, right? And it's you're all going to have ups and downs, we all do in life, and I think a lot of this can be taken or applied into different situations. And like, at the heart of it really is, I guess the question is, how do people cope effectively with difficulty? And injury certainly presents, it has some unique aspects, I guess, and that's very much a mind and body experience. But on the other hand, there's probably lots of parallels, I guess, that one could draw from the injury experience and apply it to other difficulties in life. And so I think, like, if more and more I find myself interested in doing research that is applicable or has an applied focus, and I think if one, as a coach or as someone who experiences challenge themselves, if you find you have some tools or skills to help you work through that difficulty, injury or otherwise, then that's great. Yeah, it
sure is interesting. And as you said, this to have some practical use of the stuff that we're researching about, that's really important, I think. And as a coach, that's the goodie bag of the whole package, I think. And I think also it's very important, as you understand, that we really rely on sports science. So we don't just do stuff that we think it's, well, I heard something about 20 years ago and it was a good way to handle it. So I think the field is advancing, and we know a lot more stuffs about rehabilitations than before. So it's important to take care of the new research that is conducted in this area.
Yeah, well, perfect example. So you mentioned, Stefan, the work, and it was wonderful getting to collaborate a little bit on this paper that, well done on the paper that you had published recently, looking at dropout in particular with females and in floorball. And like, a large part of that,
you were a part of that study, and it was very helpful. Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, and I think, like, to your point about taking the research, like, a lot of those sessions that you did involve meeting with parents and coaches and athletes and sharing that knowledge and information to create a more optimal environment in which dropout was less likely to occur, which is what you were able to demonstrate. And you know, so I think, like, you know, that's where yeah, you know, it's nice, I guess, when we can go beyond a little bit just doing the research. It's interesting, I guess, if you enjoy research, but again, applying it and taking it and sharing that knowledge. And it's nice when it shows that there's some impact in sport settings. And I think that was you know, your study was a great example of that with, you know, female floorball players. So anyway, well done on that.
And well done, Les, but your presentation here, and it was it's very nice to have you on board, and I would like to have you on board all the time, but unfortunately this is not possible. But hopefully you can come back in another area and another context, and well, I just want to thank you, and we will handle all those, even those stuffs that we didn't show today. We will handle the students, isn't that right? All the slides that you have, that
for sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
And also the assessment, how you the assessment of life stress scale and all those stuff that you yeah. So once again,
I just wanted to say thank you. It was very interesting to listen to you, and I got some thoughts to take with me in my role as a coach. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Alina. Yeah, I appreciate your comments, and yeah, you know, again, I've always enjoyed coming to Sweden. I think, like, you know, as a testament to your education and the quality, you know, you always, the students that I've interacted with, as was the case very much today, always show interest and a willingness to interact and discuss ideas. And so, yeah, I appreciate the chance to meet with you. Thank you.
Les, could you just stay for a moment, and I just have some talk with you, and we'll just say bye-bye to the students, and thank you very much for today, and have a nice have a nice weekend, I was supposed to say, but I would say have a nice Christmas and a happy new year, and just take care and stay safe and all this stuff, and we'll meet again, isn't that right? We'll meet again somewhere at 5th of January. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So take care and beware. Stay safe.
Merry Christmas.
You too. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
And Happy New Year.
Christmas.
Happy
Bye-bye.
holidays, everyone.
Bye. Bye.